Hey guys, tonight we step into the dusty sandals of someone whose job description is basically move rocks until the sun goes down, and then come back tomorrow to move more rocks. The air is cool for the moment, the sky only beginning to glow with that pale grey blue that comes just before sunrise. Somewhere in the distance a rooster complains about the morning. You stand among dozens, maybe hundreds of other workers, all waiting for the overseer's signal that another day of monument building is about to begin. You probably won't survive this job. I mean that kindly, of course. But if you're used to office chairs, coffee breaks, and the occasional stretch, the idea of dragging multi-ton stones across sand with a rope and your own body weight might feel ambitious. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these quiet nighttime history journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The overseer raises his staff, and just like that, your day begins. You shift your weight on the packed earth of the worksite. In front of you, looming faintly in the dawn light, is the half-built monument. Massive stone blocks rise layer by layer, stacked with a kind of quiet determination that suggests this structure intends to outlive every person standing here. Which, historically speaking, it probably will. Across the ancient world, from the pyramids of Egypt to massive temples in Mesopotamia, from Roman amphitheatres to the colossal statues of forgotten rulers, monuments were built the same way, with thousands of ordinary workers performing exhausting, repetitive labour day after day. The stones around you are enormous. Some weigh several tons. They sit waiting in neat rows like silent giants, each one destined for a very specific place somewhere higher up the structure. The ground smells faintly of dust, sweat, and damp rope. Someone next to you yawns. Someone else rolls their shoulders in preparation. Another worker quietly stretches his back, which is already shaped suspiciously like a question mark. No one speaks much. There is an unspoken understanding that conversation will come later, when the work rhythm settles in. For now, the ropes are being prepared. Long coils of thick fibre rope lie across the ground, worn smooth from years of pulling. You run your hand along one without really thinking about it. The fibres are rough, slightly sticky with old sweat and dust. These ropes are the closest thing you have to technology today. That might sound surprising, but historically, most ancient monuments were built with remarkably simple tools. Wooden sledges, ropes, levers, ramps, and human muscle. Lots and lots of human muscle. Historians still argue whether certain techniques, like wetting sand to reduce friction when dragging heavy blocks, were widely used in places like ancient Egypt. But experiments today show it works surprisingly well. Which is good news, because in a few minutes you're going to need every advantage you can get. The overseer begins assigning groups. Workers gather around specific stones. Each team might consist of 20, 30, sometimes even 50 people depending on the weight. Your team gathers around a rectangular limestone block sitting on a wooden sled. Someone coughs. Someone mutters a quick prayer under their breath. A man near the front adjusts the rope around his shoulder like a seasoned professional who's done this 1,000 times before, which, to be fair, he probably has. And then the signal comes. Pull. At first, nothing happens. The stone sits there stubbornly, like it has decided the ground is its permanent home. You lean forward. The rope tightens. The muscles in your legs and back wake up immediately with that deep, burning awareness that today is not going to be easy. Then, slowly, the sled moves. Just a little, but enough. A cheer breaks out from someone behind you, immediately followed by the collective groan of 30 people, realizing that now the real work begins. Step by step, you drag the stone forward. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, dusty, occasionally muddy depending on the season. Every few steps the sled catches slightly, forcing everyone to pull harder until the stone grudgingly slides forward again. This will continue for hours. The sun begins its slow climb above the horizon, and with it comes the heat. Already the cool dawn air is fading, replaced by that heavy warmth that promises a long, relentless day. Sweat starts appearing on foreheads, necks, backs. But something interesting happens once the pulling rhythm settles in. Your body adapts. Pull, step, pull, step. The rope creaks softly. Sand crunches underfoot. The monument slowly grows closer. Workers around you fall into a strange kind of teamwork. You begin to feel the subtle timing of the group, the moment when everyone leans forward together, the shared exhale as the sled slides another few inches. It's not graceful, but it works. Somewhere nearby, a scribe sits beneath a small shade canopy with a wooden tablet and ink brush. He's not pulling stones. Instead, his job is to record things. Which teams move which stones, how many blocks arrive, who is absent, who is injured, who deserves extra rations. This might seem like a small detail, but records like these are one reason historians know so much about ancient construction projects. In fact, workers' villages discovered near the pyramids of Giza revealed evidence that many labourers were not slaves at all, but organised workers receiving food, housing, and sometimes even medical care. Which doesn't mean the job was comfortable. Your shoulders already disagree strongly with the idea that this is comfortable. The sled hits another rough patch. The rope jerks hard against your shoulder. Several people stumble slightly. Someone behind you swears loudly enough that the overseer turns his head. But the stone moves, slowly, patiently, relentlessly. As the monument looms larger in front of you, it's impossible not to wonder about the scale of the project. Thousands of stones, thousands of workers, years, sometimes decades, of construction. Historians still argue whether some monuments took 20 years, 50 years, or even longer to complete depending on labour availability and political power. But standing here, rope digging into your shoulder, lungs pulling in warm, dusty air, you begin to understand something important. Monuments are not built by kings. They are built by mornings like this one. By ordinary workers pulling ropes before sunrise. By thousands of days that feel almost exactly the same. And your day is just getting started. The rope digs deeper into your shoulder now that the morning rhythm has fully taken hold. Pull, step, pull, step. At some point you stop thinking about the individual muscles involved in dragging a multi-ton stone across uneven ground. Your body simply handles it. Or at least it tries to. The human body is remarkably good at adapting to repetitive strain, which is convenient when your entire profession is repetitive strain. The monument grows slowly larger ahead of you, its stepped walls glowing faintly in the rising sun. From a distance it might look like a graceful architectural achievement. Up close, however, it mostly looks like an enormous stack of rocks that people like you are painfully persuading into position. And to accomplish this heroic task, your toolkit is impressively simple. No cranes, no engines, no forklifts, just ropes, sledges, wooden levers, and a truly impressive amount of stubborn determination. You glance down at the rope stretched across dozens of shoulders. It's made from twisted plant fibres, possibly flax, palm, or another local plant that can be braided into strong cords. Ancient rope making was actually a skilled craft. If the fibres were twisted incorrectly, the rope could snap under tension, which would be extremely inconvenient when several tons of limestone suddenly decide to move independently. Someone once told you about a rope snapping during a heavy pull. Apparently the sound was like a thunderclap, and the aftermath involved a great deal of shouting and several bruised workers who learned a memorable lesson about standing too close to tensioned ropes. So yes, you have developed a healthy respect for rope technology. The sled beneath the stone is another piece of quiet ingenuity. It's basically a heavy wooden platform with curved runners along the bottom, designed to slide across sand or packed earth. It creaks and groans with every inch of movement, but it distributes the weight enough that the stone doesn't immediately bury itself into the ground. Historians still argue whether workers sometimes poured water onto the sand in front of sledges to reduce friction. Ancient Egyptian wall paintings show a worker doing exactly that while a statue is dragged on a sled, which suggests the trick might have been widely known. If true, that means someone thousands of years ago essentially invented the ancient version of lubricating the road. Not glamorous, but surprisingly effective. Ahead of you, two workers carry clay jars sloshing with water. Every few minutes they splash some onto the sand directly in front of the sled's path. The darkened sand compacts slightly, and the sled slides just a little more smoothly. It's a tiny improvement, but when you're dragging several tons of stone under the sun, tiny improvements feel like miracles. The overseer walks alongside the group, occasionally tapping his staff against the ground to keep the pace steady. He doesn't shout much. Experienced teams know the rhythm already. Pull, step, pull, step. Someone near the front begins humming quietly. Not a full song, just a simple rhythm. A low repetitive tone that matches the timing of the pulls. It spreads through the group slowly. Another worker joins in, then another. Soon half the team is breathing and humming together, creating a steady work cadence that helps everyone pull at the same moment. This might sound small, but synchronized pulling dramatically increases efficiency. Even modern rowing teams rely on the same principle. Timing matters more than raw strength. The sled hits a patch of dry sand. It slows. Your legs push harder. The rope tightens across the group. The humming grows louder, and with one coordinated effort the stone slides forward again. Progress. Tiny, exhausting progress. You pass another team hauling a different block in the opposite direction. Their stone is even larger than yours, and it requires nearly twice as many workers. The sled leaves deep grooves behind it like tracks carved into the earth. One man from their group gives you a sympathetic nod. There's a quiet camaraderie among monument workers. Everyone understands the shared misery of heavy lifting under a rising sun. In fact, archaeological discoveries suggest that some ancient worker teams even name themselves. Graffiti found inside Egyptian pyramids includes group names like Friends of Khufu and the Drunkards of Menkaure, which suggests that somewhere, long before modern construction companies invented motivational slogans, ancient workers were already forming slightly sarcastic team identities. You can almost imagine your own group having a name, something inspiring, something powerful. Perhaps the people whose backs are definitely regretting this. The monument wall now looms only a few dozen steps away. Up close, the scale becomes even more intimidating. Massive ramps rise along one side of the structure, allowing stones to be dragged upward layer by layer. Those ramps are essentially giant dirt highways built just to move stones into position, and yes, you will eventually have to climb one, but not yet. For now, the stone needs to reach the staging area near the base of the monument. Your group pulls one final stretch. The sled scrapes across packed earth and finally grinds to a halt beside several other blocks waiting their turn. The rope slackens. For a moment, no one moves. Then almost the entire team exhales at once. You roll your shoulders, trying to coax life back into muscles that currently feel like damp rope. Sweat drips down your back. Your hands are dusty. Your legs are already tired, which is slightly concerning because the sun has only been up for about an hour. Welcome to monument building. Nearby, workers with wooden levers begin adjusting the sled's position. Long poles slide under the stone, allowing it to be nudged and angled precisely where it needs to go before the next stage of lifting begins. Levers are one of humanity's oldest engineering tricks. Archimedes famously said, "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the earth." You, unfortunately, have been given a rope instead, but the principle still applies. With enough people, enough patience, and enough clever use of simple physics, even the heaviest stone can eventually be persuaded into place. You glance up at the monument again. Hundreds of stones already stacked, hundreds more waiting, and somewhere beyond the worksite, beyond the rising dust and the creaking sledges, there are quarries where even larger blocks are still being cut from solid rock. Which means that while your team is busy dragging stones toward the monument, another group of workers is already deep inside the quarry, starting the process all over again, and honestly, their job might be even tougher than yours. The quarry sits a short distance from the monument site, though short is a generous word when everything you move weighs as much as a small house. By mid-morning the sun has already warmed the dusty air, and the path to the quarry feels like a slow walk into a bowl of heat. The sounds reach you first. The dull thud of hammer against stone, the scraping grind of chisels, and the occasional sharp crack that echoes across the rock face like a miniature thunderclap. This is where every monument truly begins, not with kings or architects or grand plans scratched into papyrus, but with a cliff face and a group of workers patiently convincing that cliff to surrender pieces of itself. The quarry wall rises in pale layers before you. Huge rectangular outlines have been carved into the rock like giant puzzle pieces waiting to be removed. Some blocks are already half freed from the stone, their edges traced by long chisel grooves. Others remain stubbornly attached, still part of the mountain. A group of quarry workers stands on a rough wooden scaffold, hammering copper chisels into narrow cracks. Each strike sends a small puff of white dust into the air. Tap, tap, tap. It looks almost gentle at first. until you realise they've been doing this for hours. Copper tools were common in many ancient construction sites, particularly in places like Egypt. Copper is softer than iron, which means the chisels dull quickly and have to be sharpened frequently. But copper was what they had, so copper it was. Historians still argue whether certain harder stones, like granite used in some monuments, were cut using copper tools alone, or with the help of harder stone pounders and abrasive sand. Experiments suggest workers may have used pounding stones made from dolerite, repeatedly smashing grooves into the granite until blocks slowly separated, which means that sometimes ancient engineering looked less like delicate craftsmanship and more like very determined rock smashing. You watch one worker kneel beside a half-cut block. He pushes a wooden wedge deep into a narrow crack carved along the stone's edge. Another worker brings a clay jar and carefully pours water over the wedge. The wood absorbs the moisture and slowly expands. It creaks softly. Then, after a few moments, the stone answers with a deep cracking sound as the pressure forces the rock to split along the carved line. A few workers nod with quiet satisfaction. It's not dramatic, but it works. This trick, using expanding wooden wedges, has been used in stone cutting for thousands of years. Simple physics again doing most of the heavy lifting. Nearby, another team uses long wooden poles as prying bars. They wedge the poles beneath a partially freed block and lean their weight down slowly. The stone shifts, dust falls. Someone shouts for everyone to step back. With a heavy grinding sound, the block finally breaks loose from the quarry floor and settles onto prepared wooden rollers. The workers pause for a moment. Some stretch their arms. Others wipe sweat from their faces using rough cloths or the edges of their tunics. Quarry work is brutal in its own way. The monument site demands strength and teamwork, but the quarry demands patience and precision. Cut a block wrong and weeks of effort can crumble into useless rubble. And stones are not exactly forgiving building materials. A man nearby carries a stone hammer that looks more like a rounded bowling ball with a handle. He swings it down rhythmically against a groove, each impact slowly deepening the cut. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound echoes across the quarry like a heartbeat. Dust floats lazily through the sunlight. The air smells faintly of hot stone and dry earth. If you listen carefully, you can hear dozens of teams working at once. The combined rhythm of chisels and hammers creates a strange mechanical music, like the monument itself is slowly being carved out of the landscape. Somewhere near the edge of the quarry, a small group of scribes sits beneath a patch of shade cloth stretched between poles. They watch everything. They record everything. The size of blocks, the number of workers assigned, how many stones are completed each day. Ancient construction projects were surprisingly organised. Records from Egyptian work crews, for example, show careful tracking of labour groups, supplies and schedules. This wasn't chaos, it was logistics. And if a block cracked during cutting or transport, the scribes noted that too. Not necessarily to blame anyone, but because stone planning had to be precise. After all, if you're building something that weighs millions of tons, accounting matters. A shout suddenly echoes across the quarry. Another block is ready. Workers gather around it with ropes and wooden poles. They slowly ease the stone onto a sled waiting nearby. The same sled design you saw earlier. Thick wooden runners built to slide across sand. Once loaded, the sled will be dragged out of the quarry and toward the monument site, which means your team will probably meet it later. Congratulations, more pulling. But there's a small moment of humour among the workers as well. On one smooth section of quarry wall, someone long ago carved a tiny doodle of a worker pulling an absurdly oversized stone, while another figure lounges nearby, holding what looks suspiciously like a drink jar. Ancient workplace humour. Archaeologists have actually discovered similar sketches and graffiti left by ancient labourers. Little jokes, crude drawings, even sarcastic comments about supervisors. Proof that even thousands of years ago workers found small ways to laugh about the job. Because when your entire day involves carving mountains into rectangles, you probably need a sense of humour. The newly freed stone is secured to its sled. Ropes are tightened. A team gathers around it, bracing themselves for the slow journey toward the monument. The quarry has done its part. Now the real work begins again, and somewhere in the distance, the monument waits patiently for another stone. By the time the newly cut stone leaves the quarry, the sun has climbed higher, and the day has settled into that slow, relentless rhythm that defines monument work. The sled creaks as it begins its journey. Dozens of workers lean forward into the rope, their bodies forming a long, straining line across the dusty ground. The stone behind them slides inch by inch over sand and packed dirt, its weight announcing itself with every scrape. You take your place among them again. Pull, step, pull, step. If the quarry was about patience, transportation is about endurance. The path between quarry and monument is not exactly smooth. It's been flattened as best as possible by earlier crews, but nature still insists on small inconveniences. Patches of loose sand, shallow dips in the earth, scattered stones that must be kicked aside. The sled reacts to each one. Every bump feels like a reminder that gravity exists and that it strongly prefers stones to remain exactly where they are. The workers pulling beside you settle into a practiced formation. Some lean the rope over their shoulders, others grip it with both hands, arms extended using their body weight like living counterbalances. Someone behind you mutters something about wishing the monument builders had chosen a smaller stone, or perhaps a very large pile of bricks instead. It's a fair point. But ancient builders loved big stones. Massive stones were impressive. They suggested strength, permanence, and power. A king or ruler didn't want a monument that looked convenient. They wanted one that looked impossible. And so, here you are, attempting the impossible one step at a time. Historians know that ancient civilizations moved astonishingly large stones this way. Some of the blocks used in monuments across the ancient world weigh dozens of tons. In places like Baalbek in modern Lebanon, stones weighing over 800 tons were quarried and partially moved, leaving historians still debating exactly how such feats were accomplished. Historians still argue whether advanced lifting systems, massive ramp systems, or even clever combinations of rollers and sledges made these movements possible. But the basic principle always remains the same: human coordination, human persistence, and ropes that are hopefully strong enough. The sled hits a small incline. Immediately, the entire team feels it. The rope tightens sharply. Muscles that were already working now demand even more effort. A few workers dig their heels into the sand, leaning forward like human anchors. The overseer raises his staff. Together, he calls calmly. This is the moment when timing matters most. The group inhales. Pull. The stone shifts slightly. Pull again. Another inch. Your legs burn now. Your arms feel heavier with every step, but the sled keeps moving, and that tiny sense of progress keeps the team going. One worker near the front begins calling out the rhythm. Pull! The group moves. Pull! Another step forward. This kind of coordinated pulling wasn't just helpful, it was essential. Without synchronized effort, the stone would jerk unpredictably, wasting energy and risking broken ropes. Nearby, another team pauses beside the road, their sled temporarily parked while workers adjust the ropes. One man pours water over the sand again, darkening the ground ahead of the runners. The sled slides slightly easier when your team reaches that patch. It's a small mercy. You glance sideways at the landscape stretching beyond the work road. The monument site is slowly becoming the centre of an entire temporary world. Tents, supply wagons, animal pens, small cooking fires where meals will eventually be prepared. Large monument projects often created entire worker settlements nearby. Archaeologists studying pyramid construction in Egypt have discovered planned worker villages complete with bakeries, breweries, and sleeping quarters, which may sound surprisingly civilized for such brutal labor. And in some ways, it was. Workers needed food, water, organization, and a place to collapse after hauling stones all day. The monument demanded everything. But it also created a community around its construction. A shout suddenly travels down the line. Stop! Everyone freezes. The sled is tilted slightly to one side where the ground dips unevenly. A few workers hurry to shove flat stones beneath the runners, levelling the load before it can slide dangerously. Moments like this are reminders that moving giant stones is not just exhausting, it's risky. If a sled tips or a rope snaps under strain, injuries happen quickly, sometimes worse. The adjustment takes a few minutes, then the overseer nods. Pull! And once again the slow journey continues, step by step. The monument now rises clearly ahead, its stone layers glowing pale under the midday sun. Ramps stretch along its sides like enormous earthen roads climbing toward the sky. You know what those ramps mean. The stone you're dragging is not finished travelling yet. Eventually it will need to climb, but for now, reaching the base of the monument will be victory enough. Your team keeps moving. Dust swirls around ankles. The sled leaves deep grooves behind it, permanent tracks in the earth that will soon be erased by the next stone. Hours passed like this, not dramatic, not heroic, just steady movement. And yet, somewhere in the back of your mind, a strange thought begins to form. Each stone moved, each rope pulled, each inch gained. It all adds up. One day, far in the future, someone will look at this monument and wonder how on earth ancient people managed to build something so enormous. And the truth will be surprisingly simple. They pulled. Together. Very, very slowly. By the time the stone finally reaches the staging ground near the monument, the sun has climbed high enough to remind everyone that shade is one of the most valuable luxuries in the ancient world. The rope slackens again. Your shoulders immediately feel lighter, though not exactly rested. Muscles that have been working for hours don't relax so much as slowly stop complaining quite as loudly. Around you, workers step away from the sled and stretch their backs. A few kneel down and rub their arms as if trying to convince their muscles that tomorrow is still very far away. It isn't. But for now, it's time for food, which, in a place like this, is less about comfort and more about survival. You walk toward the supply area where clay jars, woven baskets, and rough wooden tables sit beneath a line of shade cloth stretched between poles. The air smells faintly of grain and smoke from cooking fires that burned earlier in the morning. A worker hands you a round loaf of coarse bread. It's dense, very dense, the kind of bread that feels less like a baked good and more like a small building material. You could probably use it as a hammer if necessary, though historians would strongly prefer you didn't. Bread like this was the backbone of many ancient diets. In Egypt, Mesopotamia, and much of the Mediterranean world, grain, especially barley and emmer wheat, provided the majority of daily calories. Because when you're hauling multi-ton stones, your body needs energy. A lot of it. You tear the loaf open and dip a piece into a clay bowl containing a thick stew of lentils and onions. The flavour is simple, earthy, and slightly salty from preserved ingredients. It's not fancy, but it's filling. Nearby, another worker pours you a cup from a large clay jug. Beer, or at least something very similar to beer. Ancient workers often received beer as part of their daily rations. Egyptian labour records, for example, show that workers building monuments were regularly given bread and beer as payment. And this wasn't the modern crisp, bubbly drink you might imagine. Ancient beer was thicker, sometimes cloudy, and often drunk through straws to avoid grain sediment floating inside the cup. Quirky detail. Some ancient beer was so thick it was almost closer to a liquid porridge than a drink. Still, it had calories, and when you're sweating under the sun all day, calories are everything. You take a sip. Warm, slightly sour, but surprisingly refreshing. Workers sit in small groups while they eat. Some talk quietly, others simply sit in silence, enjoying the rare chance to stop moving. A man across from you chews thoughtfully on a piece of bread before speaking. Better than quarry duty, he mutters. A few nearby workers chuckle, and he might have a point. Quarry workers sometimes spent entire days breathing stone dust while hammering rock under direct sunlight. Compared to that, dragging stones at least allows the occasional breeze. Historians studying ancient worker settlements have discovered evidence of surprisingly organised food distribution systems. Large bakeries and breweries existed near some monument sites, producing massive amounts of bread and beer every day. One excavation near the Giza pyramids uncovered bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily, which makes sense when you consider the number of workers involved. Feeding a monument workforce was basically an ancient version of running a giant industrial kitchen. Historians still argue whether these workers were primarily paid labourers, seasonal farmers fulfilling labour obligations, or a mix of both. Many scholars believe large state projects used a rotating labour force. Farmers might work on monuments during the Nile flood season, when their fields were underwater and farming paused temporarily. In other words, monument building might have been a seasonal job for many people, which means that somewhere out there, a farmer is currently standing in a muddy field thinking, well, at least I'm not hauling stones today. You finish the last of your bread and rinse your mouth with water from a clay cup. The water is warm from sitting in the sun, but it's still water, and that's enough. Nearby, a small group of workers gathers around a man who seems to be telling a story. His hands move dramatically while he talks, and every so often someone bursts into laughter. Even here, humour survives. It always does. Archaeologists studying worker settlements have found small items suggesting ordinary daily life continued around these massive projects. Gaming pieces, carved toys, small decorations. Life didn't stop just because a monument was being built. It simply adapted. A scribe walks past your group carrying a wooden tablet. He pauses occasionally to mark something with his brush, likely recording which teams have completed their assigned tasks for the morning. Accountability, even in ancient times. Eventually the overseer raises his staff again. Break time is over. A few workers groan softly. Others sigh and stand up with the slow determination of people who know resistance is pointless, because the monument still needs more stones. Many more. And while you are eating, another sled has already arrived from the quarry, waiting patiently, right where you left it. The break ends the way most breaks do on a monument worksite. Quietly and a little too soon. You brush crumbs from your hands and stand up with the slow stiffness of someone whose muscles would strongly prefer another hour of sitting in the shade. Around you, other workers do the same, stretching backs, rolling shoulders, giving their legs a few test steps before returning to the ropes. The next stone waits exactly where it arrived, unimpressed by your lunch, unmoved by your complaints, and extremely heavy. You take your place in the pulling line again while the overseer walks slowly along the group, staff tapping the ground every few steps. Unlike the workers, he isn't covered in dust or sweat. His job isn't to pull stones. His job is to make sure you do. Supervisors like him were common on ancient construction projects. In fact, large monument sites often had an entire chain of oversight. Foremen managing small crews, higher officials managing the foreman, and scribes documenting everything. You glance toward the shade canopy again. Sure enough, the scribes are still there. One of them sits cross-legged with a wooden pallet resting on his knees. Small cups of black and red ink sit in carved indentations beside him, and he writes with a thin reed brush on a sheet of papyrus. Every now and then he looks up, scanning the workers and the stones like someone quietly counting the movement of an enormous machine, which in a way he is. Ancient states loved records. They recorded grain harvests, tax payments, temple donations, and, conveniently for historians, construction progress. Some of the most famous surviving work records come from the Egyptian site of Deir el-Medina, where artisans who built royal tombs kept surprisingly detailed notes about daily life. Things like work schedules, food rations, days off, even complaints. Historians still argue whether workers on massive pyramid projects enjoyed similar organisation, or if conditions varied depending on the ruler and the era. But evidence strongly suggests these projects were far from chaotic. They were carefully managed, which means when a stone fails to move on schedule, someone notices. The overseer pauses beside your group and studies the sled. He doesn't shout, he doesn't threaten. He simply raises an eyebrow in a way that suggests the stone should already be halfway to its destination. You suddenly feel very motivated to begin pulling again. "Ready," he says. Ropes tighten, shoulders brace, pull. The sled groans forward once more. The road toward the monument base is busier now than it was earlier in the morning. Several teams move stones in different directions, creating a slow, moving network of labour lines, stretching between quarry, staging ground and ramp. From a distance it might almost look like a strange procession. Workers moving in long ropes, sledges sliding along dusty tracks, supervisors walking between teams like shepherds, guiding a flock of extremely determined sheep. The rhythm returns quickly. Pull, step, pull, step. Someone near the back of your line whispers a quiet joke about the scribes. "Must be nice," he mutters, writing instead of pulling. Another worker replies, "Careful, they'll write that down too." A few quiet chuckles ripple through the group. It's true though, scribes occupied a respected place in many ancient societies. Literacy was rare, and those who could read and write often served as administrators, accountants, and record keepers. In a world where memory alone couldn't track thousands of stones and workers, scribes became the nervous system of the entire operation. Every block counted, every worker listed, every delay noted. Quirky detail. Archaeologists have discovered ancient worker complaints written on ostraca, broken pieces of pottery used as scratch paper. Some messages recorded reasons for missing work, including illness, family problems, and once famously, a worker who claimed he was absent because he had been bitten by a scorpion, which honestly sounds like a pretty solid excuse. The sled jerks slightly as it rolls over a buried rock. The rope strains. The group leans harder. For a moment, everyone moves perfectly together, and that's when the stone really glides. Only a few inches, but enough to feel the difference between struggle and success. You glance toward the monument again. The ramps are even clearer now. They climb the sides of the structure in wide earthen slopes reinforced with stone edges. Workers further up the ramp are already guiding blocks into position with levers and wooden supports. It's a slow, careful process. Because once a stone reaches the ramp, gravity becomes even more interested in participating. The overseer walks ahead of your team and gestures toward a staging point near the base. That's your destination. Once the block reaches that area, another crew will take over, specialists who handle the next phase of positioning stones for the ramp. Specialists might sound like a modern idea, but ancient construction projects often divided labour carefully. Some workers hauled stones, others shaped them, others placed them, others recorded everything. It was less like random heavy lifting and more like an enormous coordinated puzzle. Your team drags the sled the final stretch toward the base. The monument now towers above you, its shadow cutting across the ground like a cool line of relief. You cross into that shadow, and for a brief moment the air feels almost comfortable again. The rope slackens. Another stone delivered. The scribes mark something on their tablets, and the overseer nods once, already turning his attention toward the next block waiting in line. Because the monument still has many empty spaces to fill, and the day is only halfway finished. The next stone is already waiting, but before your team gathers around the ropes again, you notice something happening near the edge of the work site. A small cluster of workers stands in a loose circle, not talking much, just watching. You wander a little closer, curiosity winning over the brief chance to rest your arms. In the centre of the group sits a man on the ground, one leg stretched awkwardly in front of him. His face is tight with pain while another worker kneels beside him, examining his ankle. It's swollen, already. Someone mutters quietly, "Stone slipped." That's usually all it takes. On a construction site like this, injuries are almost inevitable. When dozens of people are moving multi-ton blocks with ropes and wooden sledges, sometimes the stone shifts unexpectedly. Sometimes a foot lands wrong. Sometimes a rope jerks harder than expected. And sometimes gravity reminds everyone that it is very good at its job. The injured worker winces as the helper gently presses the ankle. Another man brings a cloth soaked in water and wraps it carefully around the swelling joint. Ancient work sites did have basic medical care, though it was nothing like modern treatment. Archaeologists studying worker settlements near the pyramids have discovered evidence of surprisingly advanced healing practices for the time. Broken bones that had been carefully set, healed fractures, even signs of primitive surgical work, which suggests workers were not simply abandoned when injured. Skilled healers or physicians were sometimes present in large labour communities. Historians still argue how widespread this care was, and whether injured workers always received support or sometimes had to fend for themselves. But the archaeological evidence at certain sites shows at least some workers recovered from serious injuries and continued living in the settlements afterward. The man on the ground exhales slowly while the cloth is tied around his ankle. Lucky, someone murmurs, because it could have been worse. A stone rolling the wrong direction, a rope snapping under tension, or a falling block from higher up the ramp could cause far more serious harm. The overseer arrives, staff tapping softly against the ground. He kneels briefly beside the injured man, asks a few quiet questions, then gestures to two nearby workers. They help the injured man stand. He leans heavily on their shoulders as they guide him slowly toward the shade structures where the healers usually work. The circle of onlookers breaks apart. Work resumes, because monuments do not pause easily. You return to the sled waiting nearby, where your team is already tightening ropes again. The moment passes quickly, though it leaves a faint uneasiness in the air. When your entire job involves moving giant rocks, you can't help imagining what happens when things go wrong. The rope settles across your shoulder again. Pull, step, pull, step. The familiar rhythm returns, but your muscles now carry a deeper fatigue than they did earlier in the day. The morning strength has begun fading, replaced by that slow burning ache that builds with every repeated movement. Your palms feel rough from the rope fibres, your legs feel heavier, and the sun, well, the sun has fully committed to being unpleasant now. Dust clings to sweat along your neck and arms. The air shimmers slightly above the ground, where heat reflects off pale stone surfaces. Some workers wrap cloth around their heads for shade, others simply squint and keep pulling. Ancient monuments were often built in climates that were not exactly gentle on human endurance. Egyptian pyramids rose under desert skies. Mesopotamian ziggurats stood in hot river valleys. Temples across ancient civilizations frequently demanded labour under open sun. Nature rarely offered perfect working conditions, but work continued anyway. Nearby, another team pauses while one worker massages his shoulder. Muscle strain is probably the most common injury here. Backs, knees, hands. The body gradually absorbs the cost of building something meant to last centuries. Quirky detail, skeletal remains from ancient worker cemeteries often show signs of heavy repetitive labour, thickened bones in the arms and shoulders, worn joints, and stress fractures. Archaeologists studying these skeletons can sometimes tell which individuals likely performed physically demanding work during their lives. In other words, the human body quietly records the story of labour long after the monument itself is finished. Your sled reaches a rough patch in the ground. The stone slows. The rope tightens again. Everyone leans forward together. Pull. The block slides a few inches. Pull again. Another inch gained. The work continues like this for what feels like hours. Time stretches strangely when your world becomes nothing but rope, dust, and slow progress. Eventually the sled reaches another staging point near the base of the monument ramp. The rope loosens. Your arms drop gratefully to your sides. You roll your shoulders, listening to the soft crackle of joints that have been working all day. Above you, workers on the ramp guide stones higher into the growing structure. From below they look almost like ants climbing a hill made of sunlight and stone, each block placed carefully, each layer rising slowly. And somewhere behind you, back at the quarry, another team is already cutting the next stone that will follow this exact same path. Injuries will happen. Fatigue will grow. Days will repeat themselves again and again. But the monument will continue rising, because that's what monuments do. They demand patience. They demand endurance. And sometimes they demand a little suffering too. By the time the sun finally begins to sink toward the horizon, the worksite starts to change its mood. The pulling slows, the shouting from overseers softens, and the constant scraping of sledges gradually fades into the background like the final notes of a long, exhausting song. Your arms feel like heavy ropes now, appropriate considering the amount of rope you've handled today. Every muscle seems to hum with a deep, tired warmth, the kind that only arrives after a full day of hauling stones under an unforgiving sun. The monument looms above you, a little taller than it was this morning. Not dramatically taller, but enough. Enough to remind everyone that the work, slow as it feels, is actually moving forward. The overseer finally lowers his staff and nods toward the worker camp. That's the signal. The day is done, no cheering breaks out, nobody jumps with excitement. Monument workers tend to celebrate the end of the day in quieter ways, mostly by walking slowly toward the sleeping area and collapsing somewhere comfortable, or at least somewhere that looks vaguely less uncomfortable than standing. The worker settlement spreads across a flat stretch of land near the monument site. From a distance it looks like a cluster of low mud brick huts mixed with temporary shelters made from reeds, cloth and wood. Smoke drifts lazily from cooking fires. The smell of bread and roasted grain floats through the warm evening air. And for the first time all day, the atmosphere feels almost peaceful. You pass rows of simple huts as you walk deeper into the camp. Each structure is small, just enough room for a few sleeping mats, maybe a storage jar or two, and little else. Privacy is not exactly a luxury here, but shelter matters. Archaeologists studying ancient worker villages, particularly those discovered near the pyramids at Giza, have found evidence that many labourers lived in organised housing areas during construction projects. Some houses contained long sleeping benches where multiple workers rested side by side. Others had small courtyards where food preparation and daily chores took place, which means the ancient monument workforce didn't just appear each morning out of nowhere. They lived here, worked here, rested here. You duck into one of the shared sleeping shelters where a few workers are already settling in. Someone sits near the entrance repairing a sandal strap using a small bone needle. Another man lies flat on his back staring at the ceiling like someone who has just discovered gravity again. A clay lamp flickers gently in the corner, filling the room with warm golden light. Your sleeping space is simple, a woven mat laid across a raised mud platform. You lower yourself onto it carefully. Your body immediately votes in favour of staying there forever. Outside, voices drift through the evening air. Workers talk quietly, some laughing, others telling stories from earlier in the day. One man proudly describes how his team managed to drag a particularly stubborn stone across a sandy incline without losing momentum. Another worker insists the stone only moved because someone poured extra water on the sand. The debate grows animated. Historians still argue whether water lubrication was essential for moving heavy sledges. Apparently monument workers argue about it too. Some things never change. A small group nearby plays a simple board game scratched into a flat stone slab. Little carved pieces move slowly across the grid while spectators offer helpful advice that mostly sounds like friendly criticism. Games like these were surprisingly common in ancient cultures. In Egypt, a popular board game called Senet involved moving pieces across a grid while navigating symbolic spaces representing the journey to the afterlife. No one here seems to be thinking about the afterlife at the moment. Mostly they're thinking about food and sleep. Quirky detail. Archaeologists excavating ancient worker sites have found small personal objects, amulets, combs, carved figurines, even musical instruments, suggesting that life after work involved more than just collapsing from exhaustion. People still needed moments of normal life. You sit up briefly as a bowl of evening stew is passed around the shelter. Tonight it's a mixture of beans, onions and herbs simmered slowly over one of the campfires. It tastes wonderful, mostly because you're starving. Nearby, someone begins humming again, the same slow rhythm you heard earlier while pulling the ropes. This time the humming turns into a quiet song, soft enough that it blends with the crackling of firewood outside. You stretch your legs across the mat. Your arms feel heavy. Your eyelids feel heavier. Through the shelter doorway you can still see the monument rising in the distance, its pale stones glowing softly in the fading light. Workers continue moving along the ramps even now, finishing the final placements of the day. Tomorrow they'll begin again before sunrise. More stones, more ropes, more slow progress. Historians still debate exactly how workers felt about these massive building projects. Were they proud participants in something sacred and monumental, or were they simply labourers completing the tasks assigned to them by powerful rulers? The answer may have been both. But lying here on your woven mat, listening to the quiet sounds of the camp settling into night, one thought becomes very clear. No monument rises without thousands of ordinary evenings like this one. Evenings filled with tired workers, simple meals, quiet laughter, and bodies slowly recovering just enough to do it all again tomorrow. Morning returns quietly, not dramatically, just the slow pale light of dawn sliding across the worker camp, while most people are still deciding whether their muscles are willing to cooperate today. Your body votes no. Unfortunately, monument schedules rarely accept votes. You sit up on the woven mat and immediately notice the familiar stiffness in your back and shoulders. Yesterday's pulling has left its mark, and your arms feel like someone replaced them with slightly heavier versions overnight. Around you, other workers stir awake. Someone yawns loudly. Someone else stretches and produces a series of impressive joint cracks that sound almost architectural in nature. Outside, the camp is already coming alive. Fires are being lit. Clay jars are being filled with water. Bakers are removing the first loaves of bread from ovens that have been warming since before sunrise. Another day is beginning. But before the ropes and sledges return, something else happens first. A group of workers gathers near a small shrine at the edge of the settlement. You wander over with them, rubbing the sleep from your eyes. The shrine itself is simple. Just a stone platform with a carved figure set into the centre. Someone has placed small offerings beside it. Breadcrumbs, flowers, a tiny clay figurine shaped like a protective animal. Religion and monument building were deeply connected in many ancient cultures. Massive structures were often dedicated to gods, rulers believed to have divine power, or sacred purposes tied to the afterlife, which meant that the workers building them sometimes saw their labour as part of something larger. You stand quietly as one of the older workers murmurs a short prayer. Nothing elaborate, just a few respectful words asking for strength, protection, and maybe, if the gods are feeling generous, a slightly lighter stone today. A few workers touch the stone platform before heading back toward the worksite. Quirky detail: archaeologists have found small shrines and religious symbols within ancient worker settlements, suggesting that daily worship or protective rituals were common among labourers. When your job involves moving giant rocks for a living, you might appreciate a little divine backup. Historians still argue about the exact role belief played in motivating ancient workers. Some scholars believe religious devotion helped people accept the hardships of monumental construction. Others suggest practical concerns, food rations, seasonal labour obligations, and social pressure were far stronger motivators. The truth was probably a mixture of both. Faith and practicality often travel together in human history. You finish a quick breakfast of bread and watered beer before returning to the monument site. The early air still holds a bit of coolness, though everyone knows it won't last long. The ramps rise ahead of you again, and today, something new waits. Instead of dragging stones across the flat ground, your team has been assigned to the ramp crew, which means the stone you pull will be climbing. You approach the base of the ramp where a sled already sits waiting with a heavy limestone block secured on top. The ramp itself is wide and sloped, made from packed earth reinforced with stones along the sides to prevent collapse. It stretches upward along the monument wall like a giant sandy road leading into the sky. Workers stand along both sides of the sled preparing ropes and wooden braking posts, because pulling a heavy stone uphill is only half the challenge. Stopping it from sliding back down is the other half. The overseer gestures toward the rope team. You take your place. The rope feels familiar now, though your shoulders politely remind you that familiarity does not equal comfort. Pull, the overseer calls. The sled shifts slightly. Immediately the incline makes itself known. Gravity has opinions, very strong opinions. Your legs push harder against the ramp surface while the team leans forward as one. Workers along the sides place wooden chocks behind the sled runners every few feet, creating temporary brakes if the stone tries to slip. Pull, step, pull, step. The ramp climb is slower than anything you did yesterday. Each movement requires more effort, more coordination. The sled inches upward with stubborn reluctance. But slowly it climbs. You glance down the ramp behind you. The ground below already feels surprisingly far away. From this height you can see the full scale of the construction site. The quarry road winding across the landscape, the worker camp clustered near cooking fires, and teams of labourers moving like ants across the dusty terrain. All of it focused on this monument. This enormous project that demands years of labour from thousands of people. Historians still debate exactly how some of the largest monuments were engineered, especially when ramps had to grow taller and more complex as structures rose higher. Straight ramps, spiral ramps, internal ramp systems hidden within the monument itself. The possibilities are still discussed today, but standing here on the ramp, rope across your shoulder, the method feels simple. Pull upward, very slowly, together, and eventually. The stone reaches the top. By the time your team reaches the upper section of the ramp, the air feels different. Not cooler exactly. Unfortunately, the sun still has full authority over the temperature, but the breeze is stronger up here. It moves across the rising monument walls, carrying away some of the dust and sweat that cling stubbornly to every worker below. The sled stops with a dull scrape as wooden chocks slide under the runners. For a moment nobody moves. Everyone breathes. Pulling the stone up the ramp has taken far longer than dragging it across flat ground, and your legs feel like they've been slowly negotiating with gravity for the past hour. But the stone has arrived, and now another team takes over. These workers carry long wooden poles, levers polished smooth from years of use. A few squat beside the block while others position smaller stones and wooden wedges along its edges. This is the part where brute strength slowly turns into careful engineering. You step back with the rope team while the placement crew begins their work. Levers slide under the stone. One worker calls out a quiet count. Now! Several men push down on the poles. The stone lifts slightly, just enough for another worker to shove a wedge beneath it. When the pressure releases, the block settles onto the wedge with a soft thud, a few inches gained. Then the process repeats. Lever, lift, wedge, lower, again and again. The movement is slow but surprisingly precise. Over time, these small adjustments guide the stone exactly where it needs to sit within the monument wall. Historians often point out that ancient builders understood mechanical advantage extremely well, even without advanced machinery. Levers, ramps, rollers, wedges — these simple tools allowed workers to control enormous weights with careful coordination. The principle behind a lever was famously explained by the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes, who once claimed that with the right lever and a place to stand, he could move the earth. You glance at the workers levering the stone. They probably wouldn't mind testing that theory. Nearby, another group uses wooden mallets to gently tap the block's edges, nudging it into alignment with the surrounding stones. Thin layers of mortar, made from gypsum or lime mixtures depending on the culture, are spread between blocks to help stabilise the structure. Contrary to popular belief, many ancient monuments were not perfectly tight stone puzzles. Mortar often played an important role. Quirky detail. In some pyramid blocks, archaeologists have discovered tiny gaps filled with mortar that helped builders adjust stones that were slightly irregular in shape. So even ancient monument builders occasionally had to improvise. The stone inches closer to its final position. From up here, you can see the careful geometry of the structure forming. Each block supports the next layer above it. Every row must be level, stable, and properly aligned, or the entire structure risks shifting over time, which is exactly the kind of problem you want to avoid when building something meant to last thousands of years. A scribe stands nearby again, writing on his tablet while occasionally glancing at the stone placement. He records which team delivered the block, which crew placed it, and likely how long the operation took. Historians still argue about how centralised planning worked on these massive projects. Some scholars believe master architects designed the entire monument before construction began. Others suggest the design evolved gradually during the building process as engineers adapted to new challenges. Either way, careful observation and record keeping were essential. You wipe sweat from your forehead and lean briefly against the ramp wall. Below you, the monument worksite stretches out like a living machine. Teams dragging stones, teams cutting stones, teams preparing mortar, teams building the ramps higher as the monument grows taller. Thousands of small tasks all connected to the same goal. Another lever push lifts the block again, the wedge shifts, and finally, with one last careful adjustment, the stone settles perfectly into place. The placement crew pauses. One worker runs his hand along the edge where the block meets its neighbour. A small nod follows. It fits. A quiet sense of satisfaction passes through the group. Not celebration exactly, but the calm acknowledgement of a job done correctly. Because every correctly placed stone means the monument grows stronger, and every mistake avoided means the builders tomorrow won't curse your name. The overseer gestures for the rope team again. Your rest break is officially over. Another sled is already halfway up the ramp below. More stones are coming, always more stones. You lift the rope once more and prepare to guide the next block upward. Because monument building is not about one stone. It's about thousands of them, and you're only getting started. The next sled appears on the ramp below, pulled by another team whose faces already shine with the familiar mixture of dust, sweat, and determination. You and a few others move into position along the sides of the ramp, ready to guide the ropes and help steady the block as it climbs. From this higher vantage point, something becomes easier to notice. The workers around you are not all the same. Some wear slightly different clothing, tunics tied in unfamiliar ways, or fabrics dyed with colours that aren't common in your own village. A few speak quietly to each other in accents that sound just a little different. Monument work draws people from many places. Large, ancient construction projects often pulled labourers from across entire kingdoms. Farmers, craftsmen, soldiers during quiet seasons, prisoners of war, skilled engineers and ordinary labourers could all end up contributing to the same enormous structure. The monument might belong to a king, but the workforce often belongs to an entire civilization. The sled reaches the middle of the ramp where the incline grows steeper. The pulling team slows. "Hold!" someone shouts. Wooden chocks slide under the runners to prevent the block from sliding backward. A group of workers replaces the ropes with thicker ones designed for the steeper climb. These ropes have been reinforced with additional fibre twists, giving them the strength needed to handle heavier loads on the ramp. You help loop one around the sled frame. The fibres feel rough against your hands, and they carry the faint smell of plant sap and sweat from years of use. Quirky detail. Ancient ropes could be incredibly strong depending on the materials used. Some Egyptian ropes made from papyrus or palm fibres have survived thousands of years in dry desert conditions, which means somewhere, buried in the sand, an ancient rope might still be quietly waiting for its next shift. The pulling team gathers again. Pull! The stone inches upward. You notice one of the new workers near the front of the rope line. His skin is darker than most here, and his clothing style suggests he may have travelled from a region further south along the river. Trade routes and political alliances often connected distant cultures in the ancient world. Labourers might travel long distances looking for work, especially during large state-sponsored projects. Historians still argue how voluntary these migrations were. Some workers probably arrived willingly, drawn by food rations or seasonal employment. Others may have been sent by local leaders fulfilling labour obligations to the crown. And some, especially in certain empires, may have been captives or enslaved people forced into labour. The workforce of ancient monuments was rarely simple. It was a complicated mix of lives and stories. You steady the rope while the sled crawls higher up the ramp. Behind you, two craftsmen kneel beside a stone block already placed earlier in the day. They're using copper chisels and stone hammers to shave tiny ridges from the block's surface, ensuring the next layer will sit perfectly flat. These workers are specialists, stone shapers. Their job requires patience and a steady hand rather than brute strength. One of them pauses to examine his work, brushing dust away with a cloth before making another careful strike with the chisel. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoes softly across the monument wall. Somewhere above, another crew is already preparing the next level of ramp reinforcement. They carry baskets of packed earth and small stones, widening the ramp slightly so larger blocks can continue climbing as the monument grows taller. The entire construction site operates like a chain reaction. Quarry workers cut stones, transport crews haul them, ramp crews lift them, stone shapers refine them, placement teams lock them into the growing structure, and scribes record the entire process so nothing is lost to memory alone. You glance across the monument top and notice a group of workers wearing decorative amulets around their necks. Small carved charms shaped like protective animals or divine symbols. Objects like these were common across ancient cultures. People wore them for luck, protection, or simple comfort. When your daily routine involves standing next to multi-ton stones balanced on ramps, a little symbolic protection probably feels reassuring. The sled finally reaches the top of the ramp. The pulling team releases the ropes slowly, while placement workers rush forward with wedges and levers. Another block ready for positioning. You step aside again, arms resting on your hips while you catch your breath. From here, the monument site stretches far beyond the horizon of your daily routine. Roads, camps, storage areas and quarries, all feeding the same enormous project. Thousands of workers, hundreds of stones, years of labour ahead, and yet, standing on this rising structure, you can feel something strange. A quiet understanding. Long after the workers leave, long after the ropes rot away, long after the campfires stop burning, the monument will remain silent, massive, and built piece by people just like the ones standing here today. As the afternoon stretches on, the worksite settles into that familiar steady rhythm again. Ropes tighten, sledges scrape, levers creak, and the monument quietly grows another fraction of its eventual height. But not every worker here is paid in the same way. You notice this while resting near a supply area where scribes and supervisors gather. One of the scribes is speaking with a small group of workers while pointing at his wooden tablet. Every so often he dips his brush into ink and adds another careful mark. Accounting, ancient style. Payment for monument labour rarely involved coins, mainly because in many ancient civilizations coins hadn't been invented yet. Instead, workers were compensated with rations, bread, beer, grain, sometimes fish, sometimes dried meat if supplies were generous, sometimes clothing or sandals issued by the state. In ancient Egypt, records show workers could receive daily bread rations along with several jugs of beer. This might sound unusual to modern ears, but beer was a staple drink in many ancient societies. It was nutritious, hydrating, and often safer than untreated water sources, which means the phrase, earning your bread and beer, was once very literal. You watch as a worker steps forward while the scribe reads something aloud. The man nods and receives a small clay token from a basket. Tokens like these could represent rations owed to a worker, or confirm that supplies had already been distributed. Quirky detail. Archaeologists have found clay tokens used for accounting thousands of years before writing systems became widespread. These little objects represented quantities of goods, grain, animals, labour obligations, and acted as an early form of bookkeeping. In other words, before spreadsheets existed, there were tiny clay shapes keeping track of who owed what. A few workers nearby discussed the rations quietly. "Better beer this week," one says approvingly, another laughs. "Last month's tasted like muddy river water." Quality control apparently existed even in ancient breweries. Historians still argue whether monument workers were well fed compared to the average population, or simply received enough food to keep them productive. Evidence from worker settlements suggests diets could be relatively substantial, especially during large royal building projects where maintaining a strong workforce mattered. After all, hungry workers don't pull stones very efficiently. You finish drinking from a clay cup and set it aside as the overseer approaches again. Another assignment. This time your group is tasked with moving smaller support stones used to stabilise the ramp edges. Compared to the giant blocks you hauled earlier, these feel almost manageable. Almost. You and several others carry one between wooden poles, shuffling slowly up the ramp while trying not to step on each other's feet. Even smaller stones can weigh hundreds of pounds. Your shoulders remind you of this fact immediately. Still, the lighter load offers a slight break from the massive sled pulls. Along the ramp edge, workers carefully place the support stones to prevent the packed earth from sliding away under constant traffic. Ramp maintenance is almost as important as stone placement itself. If the ramp fails, everything stops. You watch a pair of engineers, or whatever the ancient equivalent of engineers might be, studying the ramp surface with intense concentration. One points to a section where the soil has begun crumbling slightly under repeated use. The other nods. More stones are brought, more reinforcement added. Historians studying ancient monuments often emphasise that building the structure itself was only part of the challenge. Maintaining the tools and infrastructure required to build it was equally important. Ramps had to grow taller as the monument rose. Roads had to remain stable for heavy sledges. Quarries needed constant maintenance. Worker camps required food, water, and organisation. A monument was never just a pile of stones. It was an entire logistical ecosystem. You place the support stone into position and step back while another worker packs fresh earth around it with a wooden tamper. The ramp edge looks sturdier already. Behind you, another team begins pulling yet another block upward. The cycle continues. Deliver, place, reinforce, record, reward, repeat. The sun dips slightly lower now, casting longer shadows across the monument face. Soon the day will end again. But before that happens, there will be a few more stones to move, a few more ropes to pull, and somewhere back in the quarry another block has just been cut free from the mountain, waiting patiently for its turn to join the monument. Late afternoon has a different feeling on the monument site. The heat softens just slightly, the shadows grow longer, and the endless rhythm of work becomes a little looser. Not slower exactly, but lighter somehow, as if everyone senses the day's finish line creeping closer. You're standing near the ramp edge again, brushing dust from your hands after helping place another support stone, when a quiet ripple of laughter spreads through a nearby group of workers. That alone is enough to make you curious, because laughter on a monument site usually means someone has either told a good joke or done something slightly rebellious. You wander closer. A few men are crouched beside a smooth limestone block that hasn't yet been lifted into position. One of them quickly wipes the surface with a cloth, while another scratches something into the stone with a small metal point. "Careful," someone whispers. "Scribe will see." The man scratching the stone grins but keeps working. You lean in to see. It's a drawing, a very simple one. A tiny figure with a rope across his shoulders pulling an absolutely ridiculous stone that's bigger than a house. Behind him, another tiny figure sits comfortably on top of the stone holding what looks suspiciously like a cup of beer. The group bursts into quiet laughter. Ancient graffiti. It turns out that even people building monuments thousands of years ago occasionally needed a way to poke fun at the situation. Archaeologists have actually discovered similar sketches and markings hidden within ancient construction sites. Some blocks inside Egyptian pyramids contain crew marks, names of work teams, little drawings, and jokes left behind by the workers themselves. One famous example includes a crew name translated as the Friends of Khufu, referring to the pharaoh who ordered the Great Pyramid at Great Pyramid of Giza. Another crew apparently called themselves the Drunkards of Menkaure, which suggests that monument builders, despite their very serious job, did not always take themselves too seriously. The man finishes the sketch and quickly rubs a bit of dust across it to make the lines less obvious. Hidden humour. A tiny act of rebellion against the endless seriousness of the project. Someone mutters, "If the overseer sees that, you'll be hauling stones alone tomorrow." More laughter. But the mood shifts quickly when a familiar tapping sound approaches, the overseer's staff. Everyone stands a little straighter. The man who made the drawing casually steps away from the stone as if nothing unusual has happened. The overseer walks past the block without noticing. Or maybe he notices and simply decides not to say anything. It's hard to tell. Historians still argue how strict monument supervisors actually were. Some records suggest harsh discipline for disobedience or laziness. Others indicate that work crews developed strong identities and were allowed a surprising amount of independence as long as their tasks were completed on time. Human workplaces, even ancient ones, often involve a balance between authority and tolerance. Too strict and morale collapses. Too loose and productivity disappears. The overseer glances toward the ramp where another sled is making its slow climb upward. He nods once. Work continues. You return to the rope line, though the quiet humour of the moment lingers in your mind. Pull, step, pull, step. Somewhere behind you, someone begins humming again. The same steady work rhythm that seems to appear whenever the ropes tighten. But this time, another voice adds words to the tune. They're simple, slightly sarcastic. Something about hoping the king appreciates how many stones you've pulled today. A few workers join in quietly. It's not exactly a protest song, more like a tired joke set to music. Quirky detail. Archaeologists studying ancient worker communities have found evidence of group identity among labour teams. Names, shared symbols, and possibly songs or chants used during work. Team spirit, ancient edition. You glance toward the block where the hidden drawing remains. Soon, it will probably be lifted into the monument wall, where the sketch may stay hidden for centuries, or millennia. One day, thousands of years in the future, an archaeologist might uncover that stone and discover the tiny drawing left behind by a bored worker with a sharp tool and a sense of humour. A small reminder that the people building these enormous monuments were still people. People who laughed, people who complained, people who occasionally drew cartoons about their bosses. The sled reaches the top of the ramp, another block ready to be placed. The sun dips lower now, turning the monument's pale stones golden in the evening light. Soon the overseer will signal the end of the day, but for now, one more pull, one more stone, and somewhere inside the monument walls a tiny secret joke waits patiently to outlive everyone who made it. The sun is sinking now, sliding slowly toward the horizon like it's just as tired as the workers below. Long golden light stretches across the monument's unfinished walls, turning the pale stones into glowing layers of amber and shadow. From the ground, the structure already looks enormous. From the ramp, it feels even bigger. You stand for a moment at the upper level, catching your breath while another stone is carefully lowered into position by the placement crew. Levers press down, wooden wedges slide into gaps. The block settles with a quiet thud against its neighbours. Another piece added, another small victory. Down below, teams are still hauling sledges toward the base, though the pace has slowed. Everyone knows the end of the workday is close now, and bodies that have been moving since dawn are beginning to run out of enthusiasm. Even the overseers seem a little quieter. They walk the ramps, scanning the site, making mental notes about which tasks must begin again tomorrow morning. You lean against the edge of the ramp wall and look out across the work site. From here, the entire operation spreads out before you like a giant puzzle in progress. The quarry road winding across the landscape, the worker camp with its rising cooking smoke, storage yards stacked with unfinished stones, lines of workers dragging sledges that look tiny compared to the monument rising above them. Historians often talk about ancient monuments as if they appeared through mysterious brilliance or lost technology. But standing here, the truth feels simpler. This place is powered by repetition. Thousands of days just like this one. Thousands of workers repeating the same motions until the structure slowly climbs toward the sky. A worker beside you wipes his forehead with a cloth, and lets out a long breath. "Looks taller today," he says. You follow his gaze up the monument's slope. He's right. Not dramatically taller, but taller enough that yesterday's ramp edge now sits lower than it did before. That's the strange thing about these projects. Day to day, the change feels tiny, but month to month, year to year, the difference becomes impossible to ignore. Take the pyramids built during the reign of Khufu, for example. The largest of them, the famous pyramid at Great Pyramid of Giza, required roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each one placed carefully by workers using tools not much more complicated than the ones surrounding you right now. Historians still argue exactly how long that construction took. Some estimates suggest around 20 years, while others debate whether the work stretched even longer depending on labour rotations and seasonal conditions. Either way, that's a lot of mornings like this one, a lot of ropes, a lot of aching shoulders, quirky detail. Modern researchers studying pyramid construction sometimes estimate that workers would need to place several hundred stones per day to complete the project within the commonly suggested timeline, which means entire teams were likely working in coordinated shifts just to keep the pace steady. Below you, another sled finally reaches the ramp base. The pulling team stops. No one rushes forward to start the climb. The overseer lifts his staff, and for the first time all day the signal means something different. Work is finished. The ropes fall slack across the ground. Workers stretch tired arms and begin the slow walk back toward the settlement. A few linger on the ramp, glancing up at the monument as if measuring the progress in their minds. You take one last look yourself. The structure stands silent now in the evening light, layer upon layer of stone rising into the darkening sky. Somewhere inside those walls are blocks you helped move, maybe even the one with the hidden cartoon scratched into its surface. Soon the monument will grow higher, the ramps will climb further, and eventually the top will close. But that day is still far away. For now, the workers simply head back toward the camp, dust-covered and exhausted, leaving the monument standing quietly behind them, waiting for tomorrow. Because tomorrow the ropes will tighten again, and the stones will start moving once more. Morning, evening, days stack together almost the same way the stones do. Pull, place, rest, repeat. Weeks pass, then months. Then years begin sliding quietly into the rhythm of monument building. If you stood in the same spot long enough, you might barely notice the change day by day. But the monument notices. It grows. The ramps stretch higher. The lower work areas slowly disappear beneath new layers of stone. Areas that once required ladders now sit far below your feet. The structure is beginning to look complete. Not finished yet, but unmistakably close. You stand on the upper ramp again one afternoon, watching another block being levered into place while the wind brushes across the high stone surface. From up here, the entire landscape feels smaller somehow. The worker camp looks like a cluster of tiny shapes near the edge of the desert. The quarry road winds through the distance like a pale ribbon, and far beyond that, fields and villages continue their ordinary lives. Which is the strange thing about monuments. While thousands of workers devote years to building them, the rest of the world continues moving quietly along. Children grow up, kings age, seasons pass. Historians still argue about how many workers actually participated in projects like the pyramids of ancient Egypt. Older theories imagine massive slave populations working endlessly under harsh command. But archaeological discoveries in worker villages near Great Pyramid of Giza suggest something more complicated. Evidence of organised housing, food production areas, medical care, even cemeteries where workers were buried with respect near the monuments they helped build, which suggests that while the work was brutally difficult, the workers themselves were recognised as an important part of the project. You watch the final adjustments of the stone, lever, lift, wedge, lower. The block settles neatly into the growing wall, another gap filled. Nearby a scribe scratches careful notes onto his tablet again. His records may someday be the only written memory that this team of workers even existed. Names written in ink. Perhaps a crew nickname. A date marking the completion of a certain layer. Quirky detail. Some construction teams left marks on hidden interior stones. Symbols or short phrases identifying the crew responsible for placing them. These markings weren't meant for kings or priests. They were meant for each other. Little signatures buried deep inside the monument. You imagine one of those stones carrying the tiny cartoon drawn days ago by that laughing worker. Maybe it's already sealed inside the wall, a quiet joke hidden in a structure meant to last forever. The overseer walks slowly along the ramp, surveying the nearly finished upper level. His staff taps against the stone surface with a sound that echoes faintly across the monument. Even he seems to pause longer than usual today. Perhaps he's thinking about what happens next. Because eventually the monument will be finished. The ramps will be dismantled. The worker camp will empty. The quarry road will grow quiet. And the thousands of people who built this place will return to their homes, their farms, their villages along the river. Some will tell stories about the years they spent pulling stones. Others may simply return to ordinary life without thinking much about it again, but the monument will remain. Rising silently above the land long after the ropes rot away and the wooden sledges crumble back into dust. You look across the massive stone surface one more time. Thousands of blocks, each moved by human hands, each placed through patience, cooperation, and relentless repetition. Historians today still study these structures with fascination, trying to understand the engineering, the organisation, the lives of the workers behind the project. And yet the simplest explanation might be the most accurate. It was built slowly, by people who showed up every morning and did the same difficult job again, and again, and again. Eventually the overseer lowers his staff. The workday ends. You turn toward the ramp and begin the slow walk down, following the familiar path back toward the camp where evening fires are already beginning to glow. Behind you, the nearly completed monument stands tall against the fading sky, a silent record of thousands of ordinary days of labour, days that history almost forgot, but never truly erased. The evening air grows cooler as darkness settles over the quiet monument. The ramps, the ropes, the tools, all of them rest now beneath the soft glow of moonlight. The worksite that once echoed with shouts, scraping sledges and tapping chisels becomes calm and still. You imagine the workers sleeping in their shelters nearby, bodies finally relaxing after another long day. The monument rises above them like a patient mountain of stone, holding the quiet stories of every person who helped build it. Each block carries a memory of effort, a pull of a rope, a careful lift of a lever, a shared breath between workers leaning forward together, and now the wind moves gently across the stone surface, brushing past edges that were once sharp and new. The stars appear slowly overhead. Time continues drifting forward, just as it always has, long after the workers have rested, long after the camps have vanished, long after the tools have turned to dust. The monument will still stand in the night, holding the quiet echo of thousands of tired footsteps and patient hands. And as the wind softens and the world grows still, you can let your thoughts slow down too. The ropes loosen, the stones rest, and the long day of ancient labour finally fades into silence.